On a frozen morning in January 1905, 150,000 people gathered in 6 assembly points across St. Petersburg. They dressed in their finest clothes. Women and children walked at the front of the procession. They carried religious icons, crosses, and portraits of their emperor, Nicholas II. They sang hymns as though participating in a religious ceremony. They believed their little father, the Tsar, would listen to their grievances and make everything right. They marched toward the Winter Palace, the most magnificent building in all of Russia, a structure of such breathtaking grandeur that it seemed to embody the very power of God on earth. What happened next would transform that palace from a symbol of divine authority into something entirely different. The soldiers opened fire. The ice turned red with blood. Over 1,000 people died that day, with 2,000 more wounded. The massacre became known as Bloody Sunday, and in that moment, the Winter Palace ceased to be a refuge. It became a target. But the seeds of this catastrophe had been planted decades earlier in the very stones and mortar of the palace itself. The Romanovs did not simply build a residence. They constructed the symbol that would ultimately destroy them. The story begins in 1703, when Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg on marshy ground along the Neva River. Peter dreamed of transforming Russia into a European power, and he needed a capital that reflected this ambition. His first winter palace was modest, a wooden structure built in 1708 in the Dutch style he admired. 3 years later, it was replaced with a stone building, and Peter lived out his final years there before dying in 1725. But Peter's descendants understood something their forefather did not. Power was not merely about military might or territorial expansion. Power was about perception, about creating an image so overwhelming that it left no room for doubt or dissent. Empress Anna Ivanovna grasped this truth when she commissioned the Italian architect Bartolomeo Francesco Rastrelli in 1731 to design a new, larger palace. That third winter palace was completed in 1735, but even it was not enough. When Empress Elizabeth came to power, she wanted something unprecedented. She did not want a palace that merely impressed visitors. She wanted a building that would eclipse every royal residence in Europe, that would make foreign ambassadors weep at Russia's magnificence, that would prove beyond question that the Romanovs stood among the greatest dynasties in human history. She turned once again to Rastrelli and told him to create a masterpiece. Rastrelli spent 2 years proposing different plans to modify the existing structure. Finally, he concluded that nothing less than complete reconstruction would suffice. Elizabeth approved his radical new design in 1754, and construction began on what would become the fourth and final Winter Palace. The scale was staggering. More than 4,000 workers labored on the project. The building would contain 460 rooms spread across 3 stories, forming a perfect quadrangle around an interior courtyard. Each of the 4 facades was unique, yet all featured white columns against a background that shifted from sandy pink to mint green, depending on imperial whim, with golden stucco moldings that caught the northern light and seemed to glow with an otherworldly radiance. 176 sculpted figures lined the roof, each one a declaration of imperial power frozen in stone and gilt. Elizabeth demanded that work continue year-round, even through the brutal Russian winters when temperatures plunged far below freezing. As the 7 Years' War erupted and drained the empire's resources, she refused to halt construction. Money ran short. Materials became scarce. Work stopped on several occasions. Elizabeth responded by imposing a tax of 859,555 rubles on state-owned taverns. When that proved insufficient, she taxed alcohol and salt. The final cost reached 2.5 million rubles, an astronomical sum that represented years of national revenue. The laborers who built this monument to imperial power with their bare hands received 1 ruble per month for their efforts. Elizabeth died in 1761. never seeing her palace completed. It fell to Catherine the Great, who seized power through a palace coup in 1762 to inhabit the finished structure. Catherine dismissed Rastrelli and replaced much of his Baroque interior with neoclassical designs more suited to her taste. But the exterior remained as Rastrelli had envisioned it, a building so massive and ornate that it dominated not just Palace Square, but the entire city. The numbers tell part of the story. 1,886 doors, 1,945 windows. The palace covered 14.2 hectares of land, approximately 1.5 million square feet. It required over 400 stoves to heat the vast interior during winter months. An army of servants lived in the attics beneath the metal framework, so numerous that one former servant and his family managed to move into the roof without anyone noticing. They were only discovered when the smell of manure from the cow they had smuggled inside to provide fresh milk became overwhelming. But numbers cannot capture what the Winter Palace truly represented. It was not merely large. It was a statement about the natural order of the universe, about the divine right of emperors to rule over millions of subjects, about the unbridgeable chasm between those who inhabited such splendor and those who toiled in factories and fields to pay for it. The palace became the principal imperial residence of Russia. Starting with Catherine the Great, every Romanov emperor spent winters there. It was the formal seat of power, housing the throne room where the emperor received foreign dignitaries and made pronouncements that shaped the fate of nations. The grand church within the palace was granted cathedral status, making it more religiously significant than the chapels of most European royal palaces. Romanov weddings were celebrated there with rigid tradition and unchanging protocol. Even the bride's dress and the manner of donning it were dictated by custom. The palace was where the Romanovs displayed their art collections, assembled with an eye toward quantity rather than quality. Entire galleries purchased sight unseen from dealers across Europe. It was where they hosted masked balls of such extravagance that foreign observers struggled to find words adequate to describe them. It was where they demonstrated, again and again, that they inhabited a different realm of existence than ordinary Russians, and therein lay the fatal flaw, because, as the palace grew more magnificent, as its rooms filled with priceless treasures, and its halls echoed with the footsteps of courtiers in silk and ermine, the vast majority of Russians lived in conditions that would have seemed medieval to Western Europeans. Peasants toiled under a system that still bore traces of serfdom despite its official abolition. Factory workers endured 14 or 16-hour days in conditions that maimed and killed with routine regularity. Wages were barely sufficient to prevent starvation. There were no labor protections, no safety regulations, no recourse against abusive employers or landlords. The Romanovs believed they ruled by divine right, that they were the father figures to their people, and that even if they were unpopular, they acted in the best interests of those they governed. They rarely encountered ordinary Russians. They spent their time in palaces, surrounded by wealthy elites who insulated them from reality. When unrest emerged, they interpreted it as the work of malcontents and revolutionaries, rather than the natural consequence of systemic injustice. By the late 19th century, Russia was changing in ways the autocracy could not comprehend. Industrialization had created a new urban working class concentrated in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. These workers could read, could organize, could articulate demands for reform. They watched as other European nations granted civil liberties, established parliaments, limited the power of monarchs. They wondered why Russia remained mired in autocratic rule, while the rest of the civilized world moved forward. The Winter Palace became the visual shorthand for everything wrong with the system. When workers spoke of inequality, they pointed to the palace. When socialists railed against autocracy, they invoked the palace. When reformers demanded change, they marched toward the palace. The building that was designed to inspire awe and obedience had instead become a symbol of detachment and excess, Nicholas II ascended to the throne in 1894. He was a man of limited imagination and vision, convinced that maintaining autocratic power was not merely his right, but his sacred duty to God and country. He believed that any concession to democratic reforms would be a betrayal of his ancestors and a surrender to chaos. He could not understand that the world had changed, that the old certainties no longer applied, that clinging to absolute power in an age of mass politics and industrial capitalism was not preservation, but suicide. In 1904, Russia went to war with Japan over imperial interests in Manchuria. The war was a catastrophe. Russian forces suffered devastating defeats at the Masurian Lakes and Tannenberg. The military proved itself incompetent, the government corrupt and inefficient, the autocracy incapable of prosecuting a modern war. Discontent spread across the empire like fire through dry timber. On January 19, 1905, discussions took place at the headquarters of the Assembly of Russian Factory and Mill Workers in St. Petersburg. The assembly was led by Father Georgy Gapon, an Orthodox priest who had organized workers with the tacit approval of the government as a way to channel discontent into loyal petitions, rather than revolutionary action. But now Gapon and his followers decided to take their grievances directly to the Tsar. They drafted a petition in respectful terms that nevertheless made radical demands. They called for improved working conditions, fairer wages, reduction of the working day to 8 hours. They demanded civil liberties including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association. They asked for equality before the law, and, most revolutionary of all, the creation of a representative assembly elected by secret ballot and universal suffrage. These were not the demands of revolutionaries seeking to overthrow the system. These were the demands of people who still believed the system could be reformed, if only the Tsar would listen. The idea of presenting a petition resonated with traditional Russian customs. For centuries, individual or collective petitions had been an established means of bringing grievances to the attention of the Tsar's administration. The workers genuinely believed that if they could speak directly to Nicholas, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying icons and portraits of their emperor, singing hymns and demonstrating their loyalty, he would understand their suffering and grant reforms. The authorities knew about the planned march. Gapon had informed them of his intentions. The government could have responded in many ways. They could have sent representatives to meet with the workers. They could have arranged for the Tsar to accept the petition. They could have promised to review the grievances and propose reforms. Instead, they chose violence. Nicholas was not even at the Winter Palace. He had left for his country estate at Tsarskoye Selo, not thinking the situation seriously threatened him. This absence was perhaps the most damning detail of all. The little father, whom the workers trusted to hear their cries, could not be bothered to remain in the city on a day when 150,000 of his subjects planned to march to his palace with a petition. The authorities stationed thousands of armed troops at key points between the assembly locations and the Winter Palace. As the 6 columns of marchers converged on Palace Square, officers ordered them to halt. Some soldiers fired warning shots into the air. Others, whether following orders or acting in panic, fired directly into the packed crowds of men, women, and children. The shooting continued for hours. Cossack cavalry charged down fleeing protesters. When innocent bystanders lingered to witness the carnage, they too were fired upon. The official government count claimed 96 dead. Eyewitnesses reported over 200. Revolutionary groups claimed figures above 1,000. Whatever the true number, the streets ran red with blood, and the myth of the benevolent Tsar died with those who fell before the Winter Palace. Father Gapon escaped abroad and issued an open letter to Nicholas that denounced him for refusing to accept the petition. The priest's words captured the historical significance of the moment perfectly. Faith in the Tsar, which had endured for centuries as a fundamental pillar of Russian society, shattered completely. Workers and peasants, who had once seen Nicholas as their protector, now saw him as their executioner. The phrase circulated across the empire. "We no longer have a Tsar." If you've enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the hidden turning points that shaped our world. Bloody Sunday triggered a wave of strikes that spread across Russia. Within a month, over 400,000 workers had walked off their jobs. Peasant uprisings erupted in rural areas, with more than 3,000 manor estates looted or burned. Political organizations that had operated in the shadows now emerged into daylight, demanding not just reform but revolution. Nicholas responded with a mixture of repression and reluctant concession. In October 1905, after months of escalating unrest, he issued the October Manifesto, which promised civil rights, freedom of the press, the right to form trade unions and political parties, and the creation of an elected parliament called the Duma. These reforms were less than they appeared. The Duma would have limited powers, and the Tsar retained the authority to dissolve it at will, but it was enough to divide the opposition and allow the autocracy to survive. Between October 1905 and April 1906, government forces killed approximately 15,000 peasants and workers, injured 20,000 more, and sent 45,000 into exile. The revolution was suppressed, but the underlying problems remained. The autocracy had demonstrated that it would murder its own people rather than grant meaningful reforms. The Winter Palace had been the backdrop for this revelation, and millions of Russians now saw it not as a symbol of benevolent power, but as a fortress from which a corrupt and illegitimate regime defended its privileges. Nicholas retreated from public life. After 1905, he rarely lived at the Winter Palace, preferring the more secure Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, some 25 miles from the capital. The Winter Palace was used only for official ceremonies and receptions. The last major event hosted by the imperial family, there was a spectacular masked ball in 1903. Commemorating the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the second Romanov emperor. Nicholas and his wife Alexandra dressed in elaborate 17th century costume and posed for what would be their last known photograph at the palace. To the starving masses beyond the palace walls, this display of decadent nostalgia was a final insult. The ball represented everything the palace had come to symbolize. While nobles danced in costumes that cost more than a factory worker earned in a year, millions struggled to afford bread. While the imperial couples celebrated their dynasty's past glories, the present was collapsing around them. The Winter Palace had become a bubble of unreality, a place where the Romanovs and their supporters could pretend that the old order still held, that divine right still mattered, that the people would remain docile if only given enough spectacle and ceremony. The distance between the palace and the population grew with each passing year. When World War I erupted in 1914, Nicholas briefly returned to the Winter Palace to stand on the balcony and accept salutes from departing troops. Plans were drawn up to store the palace's contents and convert the staterooms into a hospital for returning wounded. From October 1915, the palace operated as a fully equipped military hospital, with its grand halls transformed into wards where soldiers who had been sent to die for the empire received treatment. But the war went catastrophically. Russia endured staggering losses on the Eastern Front. Food shortages plagued cities. Inflation destroyed savings. The transportation system broke down. By early 1917, the situation had become untenable. Workers in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed to sound less German, went on strike. Soldiers refused to fire on protesters. The autocracy that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries imploded in a matter of days. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas abdicated, offering the throne to his brother Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. The Grand Duke refused without the support of the army and the people. A provisional government was appointed, and for the first time in Russian history, the government was not led by a monarch claiming divine authority. The provisional government established itself in the Winter Palace, using the northwest corner with the Malachite Room as the chief council chamber. It was a deeply symbolic choice. The palace that had represented autocratic power would now house a democratic government committed to reform and modernization. But the symbolism cut both ways. The palace remained a target, and the government that occupied it inherited the hatred directed at its previous occupants. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, proved unable to address Russia's fundamental problems. It continued the war effort despite popular opposition. It delayed land reform. It failed to provide food for starving cities. As months passed, more radical voices gained influence. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. They promised to give power to the Soviets, the workers' councils that had emerged during the revolution. They promised to sweep away not just the monarchy, but the entire system of privilege and inequality that the Winter Palace embodied. On October 25, 1917, using the Julian calendar, still in use in Russia, the Bolsheviks launched their insurrection. The reality of this event bears little resemblance to how it was later portrayed in Soviet propaganda. There was no heroic battle, no massive assault by revolutionary workers storming the palace gates in a tide of righteous fury. The truth was far more mundane and far more revealing. The provisional government had almost no support. Railway workers and soldiers who should have defended it instead joined the Bolshevik side. Kerensky fled the city on the morning of the revolution, desperately trying to reach military forces that might remain loyal. He never found them. The ministers of the provisional government found themselves trapped in the Winter Palace with perhaps 3,000 defenders, a mixture of military cadets, some Cossacks, and a women's battalion. Throughout the day, these defenders abandoned their positions. Artillery cadets left at 6:15 in the evening, taking their guns with them. Cossacks departed at 8 in the evening and returned to their barracks. The Bolsheviks surrounded the palace and eventually issued an ultimatum to surrender. The ministers debated what to do as their communications were cut, and their situation became increasingly hopeless. At 9:45 in the evening, the cruiser Aurora fired a blank shot from the harbor, the signal for the final assault, but there was no fierce battle. Bolshevik Red Guards infiltrated the palace, many simply walking through doors that had been left open or were guarded by disabled reserves. They searched the palace's 1,500 rooms for the hiding ministers. The search took 4 hours. When the ministers were finally found cowering in an upstairs dining room, they were arrested without resistance. Some Red Guard units went on a rampage through the palace, looting or destroying valuable art, crystal, china, and glassware. The living quarters of the former Tsarina Alexandra received particularly destructive treatment. The palace's wine cellar became another victim. To prevent soldiers from getting drunk, the Bolshevik commander Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko ordered it shot. Red wine flowed through the streets and disappeared down drains, creating legends that much blood had been spilled during the fighting. In reality, the October Revolution in Petrograd was almost bloodless. The real bloodshed would come later, during the civil war that tore Russia apart for years. The ease with which the Winter Palace fell revealed a profound truth. By 1917, it no longer represented power. It represented the absence of power, the hollow pretense of authority unsupported by legitimacy or popular consent. The provisional government fell, not because the Bolsheviks were particularly strong, but because no one was willing to defend the government that occupied the palace. The building had become so thoroughly associated with oppression and inequality that anyone who tried to govern from within its walls inherited the taint of everything it symbolized. Yet, the Bolsheviks understood the propaganda value of the moment. In 1920, on the 3rd anniversary of the October Revolution, they staged a massive reenactment of the storming of the Winter Palace. Thousands of Red Guards, led by actors portraying Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders, performed a theatrical assault, watched by 100,000 spectators. This reenactment featured dramatic battle scenes, waves of revolutionary workers heroically overcoming resistance, banks of floodlights illuminating the action. It bore no resemblance to the actual event. The director Sergei Eisenstein used this theatrical reenactment as the basis for his 1928 film October 10 Days that shook the world. Eisenstein's version showed fierce fighting, brave workers dying for the cause, a genuine popular uprising against tyranny. For decades, this fictional version became the accepted historical truth. Photographs from the 1920 reenactment were retouched to remove the spectators and presented as authentic images from 1917. The storming of the Winter Palace entered Soviet mythology as one of the defining moments of the revolution, a triumphant beginning to the new socialist order. The irony is profound. The Romanovs built the Winter Palace to create an image of invincible power, to demonstrate that their authority derived from God and could never be challenged. Instead, they created a target that unified their enemies. The palace became the symbol not of strength, but of everything that needed to be destroyed. And when the revolutionaries finally took the palace, the event was so anticlimactic, so devoid of the drama they needed to justify their seizure of power, that they had to restage it as fiction. The Winter Palace symbolized a system that could not reform itself. Nicholas and his advisors had many opportunities to transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy, to grant civil liberties, to allow democratic participation in government. They refused every compromise, believing that any limitation on autocratic power would lead to chaos. In holding on to everything, they lost everything. The palace stood as a physical manifestation of this rigidity, a structure so massive and immovable that it could not adapt to changing times. The crowds who marched to the palace in 1905 did not hate Nicholas personally. Many still believed in the myth of the benevolent Tsar, betrayed by corrupt officials. But they hated what the palace represented. They hated the system of inequality it embodied, the chasm between the 1,500 rooms of imperial splendor and the overcrowded tenements where workers' families lived 6 or 8 to a room. They hated the autocratic power concentrated in a single unelected individual who could send millions to die in pointless wars, while he retreated to country estates and masked balls. By 1917, even those who might have defended the monarchy saw the palace as irredeemable. Alexander Kerensky and the provisional government tried to make use of it, to transform it from a symbol of autocracy into a symbol of democracy. But the association was too strong. The palace had been built to glorify the Romanovs, and it could not be separated from that purpose. When the provisional government fell, the palace fell with it, because in the minds of most Russians, they were the same thing. The Romanovs created a symbol so powerful that it outlived their legitimacy. Long after their dynasty ended, the Winter Palace remained the ultimate representation of what they had been, the magnitude of the building, the extravagance of its decoration, the sheer audacity of its scale. All these things that were meant to inspire loyalty instead inspired revolution. The very qualities that made it magnificent made it hateful. In building the Winter Palace, the Romanovs made a choice that seemed natural at the time. Every great dynasty built monuments to its glory. The palace was supposed to demonstrate that Russia had joined the ranks of European civilization, that the Romanovs could match the Bourbons or the Habsburgs in grandeur and taste. But Russia was not France or Austria. Russian peasants and workers lived in conditions far worse than their Western counterparts. Russian autocracy was more absolute, more resistant to reform. The contrast between the palace and the hovels made the inequality unbearable in a way that similar disparities in other nations were not The Romanovs built their own execution symbol. Not the executioner's block where Nicholas and his family would die in a basement in Yekaterinburg in July 1918. That was merely the physical end. The true execution happened years earlier, when the palace they built became the focal point for every grievance, every complaint, every dream of a better world. The storming of the Winter Palace in 1917 made the dynasty's survival politically impossible, not because of what happened during those few hours in October, but because of what the palace had come to mean. The building still stands today, housing the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest art collections in the world. Millions of tourists visit each year, marveling at the architecture and the treasures within. But they walk through rooms that once symbolized the ultimate failure of autocracy, the inability of a ruling class to understand that power, without legitimacy, is merely waiting to be overthrown. They see beauty where once there was hatred, art where once there was injustice. The Winter Palace was meant to last forever, to be a monument to the eternal power of the Romanov dynasty. In a sense, it succeeded. It did become eternal, but not in the way its builders intended. It became an eternal warning about the dangers of excess, the folly of rulers who cannot see beyond their own privilege, the inevitable fate of those who build symbols so grand that they can only unite their enemies against them. The Romanovs built more than a palace. They built the very image that would consume them, and in doing so they wrote their own epitaph in stone and gilt and blood. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that changed history forever.